beneath the heavy eaves of a noble hall in 14th century France, where tapestries hung thick with dust and the chill of autumn clung to every stone. A banquet was being prepared. The air was alive with the scent of roasting meats, spices that clung to candlelight like golden smoke, and sweetmeats glazed in honey that gleamed like molten sunlight across the table. The halls, polished and echoing, were filled with the quiet hum of servants scurrying to and fro, placing platters and carving meats with meticulous precision. Yet there was a tremor beneath this opulence, a subtle whisper in the shadows that the celebration would not be as it seemed. The lord of the manor had summoned the finest guests from across the county, courtiers in velvet, knights with gleaming rings, and scholars who spoke in measured tones. They arrived with expectations of luxury and indulgence, unaware of the horror that had been sewn into the feast itself. The tables groaned under their weight, the silver gleaming and the wine shimmering like liquid rubies in the crystal goblets. Candles flickered, casting long shadows across carved wooden panels, and the laughter of the nobles echoed into the vaulted ceiling. It was a minor victory, a skirmish that had barely made the news beyond the county borders, yet the Lord sought to celebrate it with a grandeur that would be remembered. Servants carried in pies steaming with aromatic fillings, turkeys plucked from the estate, and venison spiced with herbs that perfumed the air. All seemed as it should, the trappings of a festival, yet the banquet concealed a secret, hidden in plain sight. Rats, fattened in the secretive cellars beneath the hall, had been prepared for this occasion. They were baked into pies, hidden beneath layers of dough, and roasted in sauces purported to enhance the flavor, though no palate could suspect the truth until it was delayed. At first, the guests laughed at the novelty, some even praised the ingenuity of the chef who had orchestrated a dish both curious and lavish. Yet as the first bites were taken, subtle recoil appeared in the eyes of a few. A strange taste lingered, metallic and bitter, and a few lips twitched in unspoken alarm. Whispers spread, low and hesitant, like the rustle of silk over stone. Yet they grew into murmurs of suspicion. Some claimed the Lord sought revenge on rivals, others spoke of a curse, that these creatures carried with them the disease and misfavor of the cellar, waiting to be awakened through human folly. As the night deepened, a cold wind howled outside, rattling the shutters and carrying with it the cries of unseen animals, and those who had tasted the pies began to tremble. Nausea struck in waves, pallor crept across faces once flushed with merriment. By midnight, some guests clutched their stomachs, retching quietly into ornate bowls, while others staggered, eyes wide in disbelief. The laughter and music that had filled the hall hours earlier now felt distant, hollow, swallowed by a shadow that seemed to thicken in the corners of the room. Servants moved with practiced care, but even they whispered in fear, glancing at the Lord, whose smile had not faltered, a predator pleased with his cunning. Tales spoke of a few courtiers who vanished into the night, their fates unrecorded, leaving behind only overturned chairs and partially eaten pies, a grim testament to the banquet's secret cruelty. The manor itself seemed to shudder under the weight of the night's revelations, as if the stones remembered every bite and every whisper of terror that had passed between them. By dawn, the hall was quiet save for the low moan of wind through the corridors. Sunlight broke weakly through the high windows, illuminating crumbs of pastry, shards of silver, and the faint stains of the night's horror. The Lord's victory was celebrated not with joy, but with fear etched into the memory of those who had survived. Whispers of the banquet of rats spread beyond the manor, carried by travelers and servants who escaped its walls. The story became legend, a shadowed parable of human appetite and ambition twisted into cruelty. Scholars and chroniclers later noted it in passing, record sparse and fragmented. Yet the essence endured. A feast prepared for indulgence had been transformed into a theater of terror, and the glint of gold and crystal could not mask the darkness that had lain hidden beneath. Even centuries later, the echo of that night lingers, carried in tales and half-remembered dreams. What hunger drives a human to such meticulous cruelty? What delight is found in seasoning a meal with fear and suffering? Perhaps it is not the fullness of the table, nor the richness of wine that defines a banquet, but the shadow it casts in the hearts of those who partake. The banquet of rats endures in legend, a whisper through the stone corridors of history, a chilling reminder that behind gilded doors, human desire can turn even the most celebrated feast into a story of horror. And when the last plate is cleared, the memory of fear is the only true residue left upon the table, beneath the damp, oil-slick beams of a Venetian palazzo, where the salt air clung to stone walls and fog slithered through the canals outside. Like ghostly serpents, A feast was being prepared unlike any the city had ever seen. It was the mid-15th century, and the lord of the house, a merchant renowned for his obsession with rare and exotic delicacies, had spared no expense. Candles flickered in crystal sconces, their light refracting off gilded mirrors and polished silver, casting dancing shadows across the mosaic floors. The aroma of roasted meats, foreign spices, and baked fruits filled the air, mingling with the faint scent of sea brine that drifted from the canals. Musicians tuned their strings in the corner, producing notes that trembled like nervous breaths, while guests in embroidered silks and velvet gloves whispered eagerly among themselves. They had come expecting opulence, spectacle, indulgent sand. Perhaps they did not yet realize terror. At the center of the hall lay the marvel of the evening, a colossal fish, brought alive from the Adriatic, glimmering with iridescent scales as if it had captured the pale moonlight itself. Its eyes were wide and reflective, seemingly aware, and the chefs had prepared it with a reverence bordering on ritual. Guests circled, curious and apprehensive, drinking in the shimmer of its scales, unaware of the strange tension that clung to the air like cobwebs. As the feast commenced, the Lord raised a goblet of ruby red wine and made a toast, praising his own ingenuity and promising that this evening would be remembered. Long after the marble floors had cooled, the guests cheered, though uneasily, for something in their hearts trembled at the fish's unnatural stillness, at the way its gills twitched ever so slightly even on the silver platter. When the chef finally approached to pierce the belly of the creature, a sound erupted high, piercing, unearthly, unlike anything the human throat could produce, a scream, shrill and raw, that froze every hand in mid-motion and silenced the murmurs of awe. Some guests turned pale, clutching their goblets as if to steady themselves. Others laughed nervously, attributing the cry to an accident. Yet even they could not shake the hair standing on their necks. The Lord's eyes glimmered with something both dreadful and dark, a gleam that suggested this horror was not accidental, but orchestrated. Rumors spread instantly among the guests, whispered in urgent tones. Some claimed the fish had swallowed talismans from distant lands, imbued with curses meant to terrify and punish, while others whispered that the Lord himself had made a pact with forces beyond mortal comprehension, ensuring that his banquet would echo in memory like a nightmare. As the chefs continued their ritual, slicing the creature with precision, the fish convulsed violently, its mouth opening in a final, desperate scream that seemed almost human. Some nobles turned away, unable to witness the spectacle, yet others dared to partake of the flesh, their curiosity tempered by unease. Wine was poured nervously, the liquid catching, candlelight like blood in motion as whispers of curses and ill fate circulated the hall. By midnight, the first guest complained of dizziness, faint visions of watery depths, of trapped and struggling creatures, and a cold tremor that ran through their spines as if the Adriatic itself had entered the room. Several fell violently ill, clutching their throats, while others swore they saw faint shadows rising from the scales, twisting and writhing in the flickering candlelight. The palazzo, once alive with music and conversation, descended into chaos. The air thickened with fear and salt, mingling with the scent of roasted fish and something older, almost metallic. Some guests fled, slipping into the labyrinthine corridors and misty streets outside, only to feel the echo of the scream follow them, winding along canals and bouncing off stone walls. The merchant lord watched quietly from his raised days, a faint smile tracing his lips, as if the terror itself was an ingredient in the feast more potent than any spice. By morning, the hall was quiet, save for the faint drip of water from a leaking ceiling and the soft cries of those too ill to move, a silence punctuated only by the occasional scrape of a terrified servant tidying what remained. "Are you Mirza?" The screaming fish spread quickly across Venice, whispered in markets, along the Grand Canal, and within the gilded halls of other nobles. Some claimed it was cursed, others that it had been an omen, a warning that indulgence and curiosity could summon forces beyond comprehension. The Adriatic itself seemed complicit, carrying tales of the night on its tides, ensuring that travelers and merchants alike would remember the feast not for its luxury, but for the horror that had unfolded. The story survived in hushed tones and fragmentary chronicles, a legend that mingled with the fog and the canals, forever entwined with the city's ancient stones. And even now, centuries later, as moonlight glints off the water and gondolas glide silently beneath bridges, some swear that if one listens closely near the old palaces, one can hear a faint cry, high and quivering, a scream carried from beneath the surface of the sea, reminding all who hear it that curiosity can summon terror, and that some feasts are never truly over. Beneath the dense canopy of the Bohemian forest, where mist clung to twisted oaks and the scent of damp earth mingled with smoke from distant hearths, a king prepared a feast that would long haunt memory. The year was uncertain, lost to the annals of time, but the hall itself, constructed of dark timber and stone, bore witness to events both opulent and grotesque. Torches flickered along the carved panels, their light dancing across tapestries that depicted battles, conquests, and the grim visage of kings past. The long table groaned under the weight of roasted game, glistening fruits, and deep earthen bowls filled with stews rich and savory. Yet it was not the bounty of the table that would linger in the minds of the guests. It was the wine, a crimson liquid that shimmered unnaturally, catching candlelight like captured blood. The king, a man known for cruelty as much as for his ambition, welcomed nobles and courtiers with smiles that did not reach his eyes. They drank to his health, raising goblets that seemed heavier than they should, filled with a vintage so red it could stain memory itself. Whispers among the guests suggested that the king's hunts had been more than sport. Some claimed sacrificial rites had been conducted in secret, that the essence of hunted creatures, and perhaps more, had been steeped into the wine. As the first sips touched the lips of the revelers, a strange chill spread through the hall, seeping into bones as if the forest outside had crept in through the walls. Eyes darted nervously, for the wine carried visions shadowed forests stretching into darkness, faint cries echoing across night air, and the sense of being watched by unseen eyes. Some guests shivered, glancing at one another with unease, while others pressed on, curiosity mingling with fear. A noble woman recoiled, clutching her goblet, claiming she saw ghostly hunters move among the tables, their faces pale and twisted in silent torment. A knight muttered prayers under his breath, as if naming them might banish the phantoms that the wine conjured. The king watched with a patient satisfaction, eyes glinting in torchlight, as though he delighted not merely in the consumption of the feast, but in the unraveling of composure. In the brush of terror that touched each guest, murmurs of unease grew into stifled gasps, and some fell to the floor, unconscious, overcome by the hallucinatory chill that seemed to drip from goblet to goblet. By midnight, the hall had grown heavy with silence. The servants moved with care, clearing plates that held untouched morsels, while others whispered of spirits that lingered among the torches, of faces pressed against walls where no one stood. Some chroniclers later wrote that guests had glimpsed shadowy figures among the rafters, dancing just beyond candlelight, and that the wine had taken more than their senses. It had touched their very souls. A few who survived claimed to have heard the cries of the hunted within themselves, long after leaving the hall, and a chill that never departed, settling into bones like a winter that refused to end. When dawn finally broke, filtering pale light through high windows, the hall seemed almost unchanged, yet the silence was profound, an echo of the night's horrors. The tables bore the remnants of feasting, but beneath the plates and goblets lingered a sense of devoured spirit, of terror folded into indulgence. The Black Feast, as it came to be called in whispered tales, endured not in records or scrolls, but in the lingering memory of those who dared to sip the crimson wine. It became legend, a caution that even the most lavish halls, the richest tables, could conceal forces older and darker than human appetite, and that in the pursuit of grandeur, the line between celebration and ritualized horror might be crossed. Forever, even centuries later, travelers wandering the Bohemian would speak of a chill that rises without wind, of shadows that seem to watch from the tree line, and of a sense that some tables are never truly empty. The Black Feast reminds that ambition and cruelty, when intertwined with indulgence, can leave a mark far more lasting than any victory, and that sometimes the blood we raise in goblets is not merely wine, it is memory, terror, and the inescapable echo of human desire twisted into darkness. The air in the castle of northern Germany was thick with fog that clung to the stone walls and seeped through the narrow windows like cold fingers. It was a high cliff overlooking a jagged coastline, where waves crashed endlessly against rocks and gulls circled, crying like the distant voices of the forgotten. The lord of this castle, known for his fascination with spectacle and the unusual, had called for a banquet unlike any before. Word had spread among nobles and courtiers that the centerpiece would be extraordinary, a marvel of artistry and indulgence. When the guests arrived, they were greeted by a hall filled with flickering candlelight, where statues of wax and clay lined the walls, their forms so lifelike that even the most seasoned noble could not immediately discern flesh from sculpture. The long tables gleamed with silver and glass, laden with platters of roasted meats, pastries dusted with sugar, and wines dark and heavy as blood. Yet the true marvel was not the food, it was the statues themselves. Each one was carved with such precision that the eyelashes, the folds of garments, the strain of muscle beneath skin seemed alive. The guests moved among them, marveling, pointing, their admiration tinged with unease. There was something in the eyes of the figures that held them, something almost sentient. A nobleman remarked that he saw the wax lips twitch ever so slightly, as if the figures were on the cusp of speech. Some laughed, nervously, attributing the movement to candlelight and shadow, but the chill in their bones whispered that it was more than that. As the feast progressed, a subtle odor began to permeate the hall, faint at first, like smoke, then thickening into a scent of charred flesh and despair. Whispers spread. Some claimed that beneath the statues, in hidden chambers, condemned prisoners had been placed. They were forced to endure suffocation and torment, their forms shaping the wax and clay above, their suffering immortalized in silence. The guests ate in uneasy quiet, wine in hand, as the reality of the feast crept in slowly. Like fog rolling in from the sea, shadows lengthened across the stone floors. Candlelight flickered violently, and the statues seemed to gaze back with eyes that held secrets too terrible to name. By nightfall, the tension reached a silent crescendo. Some courtiers claimed that figures moved when unobserved, turning their faces ever so slightly, lips parting in muted screams that only the heart could hear. Others swore they saw shadows slipping along the walls, leaving trails of sorrow, and faint wails in their wake. The Lord, seated at the head of the table, laughed quietly to himself, a low, knowing sound that echoed through the stones, as if the castle itself were in on a dark joke. When the guests dared to glance at one another, they found eyes wide with fear, hands trembling upon silverware, hearts pounding in unison with the flickering candles. As dawn approached, the banquet concluded in a silence so profound that it seemed to press against the walls and ceilings. The guests departed, some staggering, some pale, each carrying an image of the statues and the horrors they implied, memories that would haunt dreams and whispered conversations for decades. The castle eventually fell to ruin, its halls crumbled, and its secrets buried in rubble. Yet local villagers spoke for generations of faces behind walls, of shadows that lingered long after the light had faded, and of a feast that had consumed more than appetite. The Feast of Living Statues endures as a legend, a meditation on spectacle and cruelty, and a warning that human fascination with artistry and illusion can be twisted into torment. It reminds that some feasts do not nourish the body, but instead feed a darker hunger for fear, for control, for the silent dominion over life itself. Even now, when the wind rattles loose stones against the cliffside and fog drifts through hollow halls, the memory of wax and clay persists, a ghostly echo of suffering captured forever in the shadows of a banquet that was more than mere indulgence. It was a theater of human cruelty made manifest. Beneath the shadowed boughs of Bohemia's forests, where mist clung to twisted pines like the breath of ghosts, a hall of dark timber awaited the king and his guests. The year had slipped into the quiet folds of the 14th century, yet in this chamber, time seemed suspended. Torches flickered along carved panels, throwing dancing shadows across the faces of nobles who had traveled far to witness the king's renowned grandeur. The long tables were laden with roasted game, bowls of rich stews, and fruits so glistening they seemed kissed by sunlight itself. Yet it was the wine, poured into deep goblets of polished silver, that held the true allure and the unspeakable terror of the evening. Its color was the deepest crimson, more vivid than the richest ruby, and it seemed almost to pulse in the candlelight, as if alive with secret purpose. The king, a man whose name would be whispered in fear for generations, presided over the hall with a calm that unsettled. His eyes gleamed as he watched the nobles toast his health, their faces flushed with wine and expectation. But this was no ordinary vintage. Some whispered that the king's hunts had been more than sport, that sacrifices had been made, that the essence of the fallen, of creatures both wild and human, had been steeped into the crimson liquid. When the first sip touched the lips of the guests, a subtle chill traveled through the hall, seeping into bones as if the forest beyond had entered, invisible and watchful. Vision blurred and perception shifted. Some claimed shadows moved independently of candlelight, that eyes watched them from corners where none could exist. A noble woman shrank back, whispering to her neighbor that she saw the forest itself in the goblet, trees dark and endless, with spirits moving among them. A knight muttered prayers, trying to ward off the sensation of unseen hunters circling the tables. Others pressed on, curiosity binding them to their seats even as fear seeped like frost through the hall. Murmurs rose to gasps, and then, for some, to unconscious collapse. The wine had touched more than taste. It had ensnared the mind, conjuring visions of shadowed hunts, cries of the fallen, and a chill that lingered in the marrow. By midnight, the hall was heavy with silence. Only the soft scrape of a servant's shoe disturbed the stillness, and whispers of the unseen filled the spaces between torches. Some guests swore they glimpsed figures among the rafters, ghostly and twisted, their mouths open in silent screams. Others felt the shadows lean close, listening, judging, pressing upon the heart. When the first pale light of dawn brushed the torches with gray, the tables bore the remains of the feast, but the memories, the terror, the visions, the chill remained as if the hall itself had absorbed them. The black feast endured in legend. It was a warning that even the most lavish tables could conceal horror, that ambition and cruelty could be distilled into a goblet, and that power, when intertwined with indulgence, can linger longer than flesh. Travelers speak still of the bohemian forests, of shadows among ancient oaks, and of wine that stains the soul as surely as the tongue. The memory of that night, of crimson liquid and whispered terror, lives on, a feast where the main course was fear itself. Mist clung to the cliffs of northern Germany, curling around the jagged stones like fingers of smoke, and the sea below roared with a voice as ancient as the hills themselves. On this precipice, a castle of dark timber and stone stood sentinel against the wind. Its towers pierced the gray sky, and its windows reflected candlelight like wary eyes. Inside, the lord of the castle had called for a banquet unlike any other, a celebration of power, wealth, and the exquisite thrill of fear. Guests arrived in cloaks of velvet and silk, their boots clattering on the flagstones, unaware that this evening's spectacle would blur the line between life and art, indulgence and torment. The hall was vast, lined with statues of wax and clay so lifelike that one might believe they could breathe. Every detail, eyelashes, veins beneath taut skin, the folds of garments was rendered with obsessive care. Guests moved among them, marveling at the craftsmanship, yet unease clung like cobwebs. The eyes of the figures seemed to track them, lips parted as if murmuring secrets in tongues long forgotten. Servants carried trays of roasted meats, pastries, and goblets of deep wine. The aromas mingling with something subtler, something almost like despair, curling faintly from corners where no servant's shadow fell. Whispers spread. Some believed that condemned prisoners had been hidden beneath the wax and clay, that the figures themselves were masks for human suffering endured in secret chambers. The feast commenced, the nobles eating with tentative curiosity. Candlelight flickered across faces and statues alike, casting long shadows that trembled and shifted in ways that the mind could barely trust. The wax lips twitched, the clay eyes glimmered with subtle movement. Some guests laughed nervously, dismissing what they saw as tricks of the light. Others felt the chill of unease settle deep into their bones, a cold that no fire could dispel. The lord presided at the head of the table, eyes glinting with satisfaction, as though the hall itself were his instrument and fear his secret melody. By midnight, murmurs became gasps. Shadows moved independently of flame, dancing along walls and floors. Figures seemed to shift positions when unobserved, lips parting in silence. Screams, a nobleman, too bold, dared to speak, in a faint, almost imperceptible groan reverberated through the hall, like the castle itself responding. Wine trembled in goblets, knives clinked against plates, yet the guests felt the presence of something unseen, observing, judging. Hearts pounded in synchrony with candle flames, and some claimed to feel a touch upon their shoulders where no hand could have been. As dawn approached, the feast ended. Guests departed, pale and shaken, carrying images of the statues and the terror they implied, memories that would haunt their dreams and whispered conversations for decades. The castle fell to ruin in later years. Its halls crumbled, yet villagers whispered for generations of faces behind walls, of shadows that lingered long after the light faded. The feast of living statues endured as a legend, a meditation on cruelty, spectacle, and human fascination with illusion. It reminded all who heard the tale that some feasts do not nourish the body, but feed darker hungers. The hunger for fear, for dominion over life, and for witnessing the slow unraveling of the living through the guise of art. Even now, when wind rattles stones along the cliffside and fog seeps through hollow halls, the echo of wax and clay persists, a ghostly whisper of suffering captured in shadow and silence. The winter of 15th century Milan pressed against the city with a merciless chill. Snow fell in thick sheets, covering the streets in a white silence that muffled the creak of wooden carts and the distant cries of beggars huddled in doorways. Within the fortified walls of a wealthy duke's palace, however, warmth and light glimmered, spilling from tall windows into the frozen streets. The duke had declared a feast to celebrate the entrance of his house, an act of generosity to the city's nobles and dignitaries. Candles flickered in sconces of polished bronze, their flames reflected in mirrors and polished silver. Tables groaned with the weight of roasted meats, gilded pastries, and fruits glazed with honey. The scent was intoxicating, rich, sweet, and heady with roasted spices, but beneath the opulence lay a shadow that would linger long after the last bite. Whispers spread among servants and cooks, hushed and fearful of a darker purpose behind the banquet. Some claimed that the duke's kitchens had prepared not only the flesh of deer and swan, but something far more forbidden. In secret, bodies of those condemned or disappeared had been used to enhance the lavishness of the feast. The guests, clad in velvet and ermine, arrived expecting indulgence, oblivious to the rumors that coiled through the palace like smoke. They marveled at the abundance, tasting delicate morsels and sipping wines that shimmered in the candlelight, each unaware that hunger had been twisted into something grotesque. That gluttony might soon be repaid in horror. As the evening progressed, subtle unease began to settle over the table. A nobleman remarked upon the unusual texture of a roast, a hint of bitterness beneath the honey glaze. A lady's eyes widened as a faint, coppery scent mingled with the aromas of spiced meats. Laughter continued, but it was nervous, punctuated by coughs and uneasy glances toward the kitchens. Some courtiers whispered that the duke had orchestrated the feast to display power, to show that even those who dined on the finest delicacies could unknowingly partake in his darker designs. Others feared it was revenge for old rivalries, or a cruel amusement intended to test the limits of decorum and appetite. By nightfall, several guests had grown violently ill, staggering from the hall in silence, faces pale and eyes wide with horror. A few vanished entirely, their fates unrecorded, leaving behind empty chairs and overturned goblets, a testament to terror disguised as generosity. Servants moved quietly, removing remnants of the feast, but the hall seemed saturated with a sense of unease, the walls echoing whispers and faint moans that no candle could dispel. The duke himself remained, a faint smile tracing his lips, his eyes glittering with satisfaction at a banquet that had fed both body and fear. The tale of the cannibals' banquet in Milan persisted through chronicles and whispers, debated for centuries, legend or truth, literal or allegorical. It mattered little to the memory it left. The feast endured as a dark reminder that hunger can twist morality, that power and desperation can transform indulgence into horror, and that sometimes the richest tables conceal the deepest terrors. Even today, the cold streets of Milan carry echoes of that winter, and stories linger of a feast where gluttony and cruelty were served together, leaving only shadows where trust and innocence once sat. The Scottish Highlands were cloaked in fog that rolled over glens and moors like a living, whispering tide. In a stone hall perched atop a jagged hill, a lord prepared a feast that had been long anticipated by local nobles. Torches sputtered against the damp walls, their golden light trembling across tapestries and wooden beams. The long table was laden with roasted meats, buttery pastries, and rich wines. Yet it was not these delicacies that drew the eye, but a living centerpiece, a rooster, perched proudly atop an ornate platter, its feathers glimmering in torchlight, like shards of emerald and gold. The Lord claimed it would bless the feast, a symbol of prosperity and vigilance. But as the guests took their seats, an unease settled over them, as though the bird carried the weight of secrets far older than the hall itself. The first courses were served, silverware clinking against plates, and the guests murmured in polite admiration of the bird's iridescence. But soon, a sound began, a shrill, piercing cry that cut through the clatter and murmurs, a cry that was not merely avian, it had a human edge, a tone of despair and mourning that seemed to reverberate through the walls themselves. Guests froze mid-bite, hearts hammering as the cry persisted, echoing against stone and timber. Some attempted to laugh it off, attributing the sound to nerves or superstition. But the Lord's pale smile suggested a darker truth. The bird's eyes, sharp and glimmering, seemed to watch each guest individually, and whispers grew among the diners that the rooster carried not blessing, but prophecy. As the evening wore on, visions seeped into the minds of those present. Guests claimed to see past battles unfold before them, massacres in fog-laden glens, blood seeping into the earth, men and women frozen in the throes of terror. The cries of the rooster harmonized with these images, rising and falling as though narrating the tragedies. Some fled the hall, only to find that even the corridors and stairways echoed with the bird's mournful wails. Others remained, paralyzed by fascination and dread, tasting the meats and wine with trembling hands, each bite mingling with the shadow of fear that had settled over the banquet. By midnight, the hall was silent save for the rooster's cries, which seemed to seep into the walls and linger in the very air. Nobles spoke in hushed tones of the bird's uncanny resemblance to human, grief of visions that returned to them in dreams long after they had departed. The Lord watched with quiet satisfaction, a conductor of sorrow orchestrating an unseen symphony of dread. Some guests never left the hall whole. Others carried the echoes of the rooster's lament into the highlands, their minds haunted by images that could not be unseen. The feast of the rooster of sorrows endured in legend, a dark meditation on memory, prophecy, and the lingering weight of human violence. It reminded all who heard it that animals might bear witness to what humans prefer to forget, and that even a banquet meant for celebration could become a stage for terror. To this day, travelers across the Scottish Highlands whisper of a cry carried on the wind, a lament so human it chills the marrow, and some swear that the ghostly voice belongs to a bird perched eternally atop a banquet that never ends, singing of the sorrow of those who came to feast and found themselves instead in the grip of visions and mourning beneath the vaulted arches of a French manor, far from the bustle of sunlit streets. A banquet was prepared in a crypt that had long slept beneath the ancestral hall. The scent of damp stone mingled with the faint traces of incense. Candles guttered in sconces of wrought iron, and the shadows of the dead stretched across walls like slow-moving specters. Guests arrived in heavy cloaks, their footsteps echoing hollowly against the flagstones, drawn by the promise of a feast steeped in ceremony and the peculiar reverence of tradition. Long tables were arranged around open coffins, their lids removed, to reveal ancestors dressed in fine attire, faces serene or so it seemed beneath the flickering glow of countless candles. The Baron welcomed the nobles with a quiet dignity, his eyes glinting as he gestured to the tables, platters of roasted meats, spice pastries, and glasses of deep, ruby wine shimmered under the candlelight. At first, the arrangement seemed an homage, a ritual of remembrance designed to honor the lineage and legacy of the house. Yet, as the guests dined, an almost imperceptible odor began to waft through the hall, the cold, earthy scent of decay, subtle at first, then growing insistent. Some diners exchanged uneasy glances, noting the slight tremor in their hands as they raised goblets, while shadows seemed to twitch and lean toward the living, drawn as if by curiosity or malice. Whispers soon filled the crypt, soft at first, like the rustling of silk or the breath of the dead, yet growing more distinct with each toast. Some claimed they heard fingernails scraping against wooden coffins, muffled whispers of names long forgotten, voices offering warning or reproach. The candlelight flickered violently, and with each sway of flame, the ancestral faces appeared to shift subtly, an eyelid lowered, a lip curled, a hand moved where none should. Wine and food became a background to the uneasy tension that thickened like fog. Guests swallowed hastily, trying to mask their fear behind polite conversation. But the air was heavy, laden with the impression that the past itself was observing, judging, and perhaps even exacting subtle vengeance. By midnight, the hall had transformed. Shadows seemed to pulse with life. A chill crept through bones, impervious to fire or cloak. Some guests reported faint, desperate cries from beneath the coffins, sounds that caused hearts to pound and breaths to catch in their throats. A noble woman fainted as the candlelight flickered across a visage that seemed to gaze directly at her, eyes impossibly alive. Others dared not look, but the sense of presence pressed upon them, unrelenting and unyielding. The Baron remained calm, serene, even as if the crypt, the candles, the tables, and the whispered terrors were all part of a careful orchestration only he could comprehend. As dawn approached, the guests departed in silence, haunted and pale. The feast remained, the tables cleared of food, but still heavy with the weight of memory. The candlelit coffin feast endured in whispers and stories, a tale of devotion intertwined with dread, of mortality laid bare alongside indulgence, and of a hall where the living dined with the dead, uncertain which presence was more fearsome. Generations later, travelers and villagers would recount strange lights flickering in the crypt, or a faint echo of voices in the dark corridors, and the tale persisted as a meditation on the thin veil between life and death, and the lingering impression of a feast that nourished not only body, but the shadow of terror itself. In a Flemish town where cobbled streets twisted between narrow houses, a festival of sorts had been declared in honor of a visiting noble, whose reputation preceded him like a shadow. This man, a figure of both admiration and unease, claimed to have tamed the local rat population, a boast that stirred curiosity among the townspeople and suspicion among those wise to superstition. The feast was set in the great hall of the town's guild house, tables lined with white cloths and silver, platters that air thick with the scent of roasted meats, honeyed pastries, and freshly baked bread. But the centerpiece was not a roast or pie, it was a grotesque arrangement of the very creatures the noble claimed to command. Tiny rodents roasted and arranged into elaborate patterns, as if each had been meticulously placed for a dark artistry. Guests, both noble and common, approached the table with tentative fascination. Musicians played eerie melodies on fiddles and flutes, tunes that seemed to twist and curl around the edges of the hall like smoke, unsettling in their unnatural cadence. Some townspeople laughed nervously at the spectacle, daring themselves to taste the roasted rats, while others looked away, repulsed and uneasy, as if acknowledging the centerpiece might summon unseen consequences. The noble, eyes glinting under candlelight, declared that those who refused to partake would vanish. A declaration met with shivers rather than defiance. The balance between curiosity and fear tightened with every passing moment. As the first bites were taken, whispers began to spread among the diners. Some felt eyes upon them that did not belong to the living. Shadows shifted in corners with intent. A faint scratching, like nails across timber, echoed above the music. And for those who dared glance at the noble, he smiled with a precision that chilled the marrow. By the end of the night, several guests had vanished entirely. Chairs sat empty, plates untouched, and the melody of the musicians lingered in the air long after the hall had grown silent. Others, who had eaten, were stricken with unease so profound that sleep became impossible for weeks. Dreams invaded by the chirping of rats, the twisted patterns of meat, and the faint, imperious gaze of the noble who orchestrated it all. The Pied Piper's supper endured in whispered legend, a grim meditation on obedience, superstition, and the fragility of courage when confronted with the uncanny. The tale warned that indulgence could carry a price unseen, and that feasts, like melodies, could lure one into shadows from which there was no easy return. To this day, tales persist of vanished diners and of a noble whose eyes, in the flickering of candlelight, seemed to command not only rats, but the very hearts of those who would dare to feast upon curiosity entwined with fear. In the heart of England, where stone keeps rose like jagged teeth against the gray sky, a king notorious for cruelty prepared a feast that would linger in whispers for generations. The hall was vast, its walls adorned with tapestries depicting conquest and victory, torches flickering against polished shields and the carved faces of ancestors. Long tables were laid with platters of meats, golden pastries, and bowls of spiced fruits. Yet the true centerpiece of the evening was a confection designed with deliberate malevolence. Caramelized nuts, glazed to perfection, hiding jagged fragments of iron beneath their sweet sheen. The guests, dressed in silk and velvet, murmured their delight, unaware of the hidden peril beneath their gilded bites. As the first morsels were tasted, a sharp, unnatural crack echoed through the hall. Nobles winced, teeth shattered against the iron hidden within their desserts. Some laughed nervously, thinking it a trick of chance, but the metallic tang of blood quickly replaced the sweetness on their tongues. Panic began to ripple through the diners as they realized that no one was spared. The jagged shards were scattered, deliberately, a cruel design meant to wound as subtly as it delighted. The clatter of silver against broken enamel mingled with muted cries, gasps, and whispered prayers. The elegant hall transformed into a theater of pain. The king watched from the high days, a faint smile tracing his lips, as though the suffering of his courtiers were an essential seasoning to the meal itself. Some guests collapsed in agony, clutching lips and jaws as the shards tore flesh from gums and palate. Others struggled to maintain composure, hands trembling as they raised goblets to wash down the fragments of blood and iron. Courtiers whispered of revenge, of a test of loyalty, or of a sadistic experiment to measure obedience and fortitude under pain. The hall, once filled with the scent of roasted meats and spice wine, now carried the sharp tang of blood mingled with fear. Shadows seemed to quiver with each strained cry, candlelight flickering against the pale, grimacing faces of the wounded. By midnight, silence had returned, fragile and uneasy. Guests nursed their injuries, some pale and trembling, others scarred in memory if not in flesh. The king remained at his throne, eyes gleaming, fully aware of the impression left by the Feast of Broken Teeth. Chroniclers debated whether it was punishment, cruelty, or a perverse amusement, but all agreed that the hall had witnessed a banquet where indulgence and agony were inseparable, where a meal itself became a weapon. The story endured, a chilling reminder that excess could disguise cruelty, that beauty and sweetness could conceal terror, and that even a gilded table could transform into a landscape of pain. The Feast of Broken Teeth became legend, a meditation on the fragility of trust, the subtle power of fear, and the hidden dangers that can lie beneath the surface of the most sumptuous indulgences. It lingered in memory as a warning that sometimes the most exquisite delights carry a bite far sharper than mere taste. In a minor Italian principality, during a winter when the night seemed endless and the winds carried whispers of past executions, a feast was laid that would long haunt memory. The prince, a man of ostentation and dark curiosity, had decreed that the hall would glow with candles unlike any seen before. These were no ordinary lights. They were forged not from wax, but from rendered human fat, drawn from the bodies of those executed for crimes or perhaps merely for displeasing the sovereign. As the guests arrived, robes heavy with embroidery and faces pale with anticipation, the hall's flickering glow cast grotesque shadows that danced across walls of polished stone and frescoed ceilings. The light was sickly, yellowed, uneven, as if the flame itself recoiled from the source of its fuel. Tables were laden with platters of roasted meats, spice pastries, and goblets of deep wine. Yet the room carried a subtle, unsettling Santan iron tang, faintly sweet, that clung to air and cloth alike. Guests murmured politely, casting glances toward the candles, but the prince's smile and calm demeanor encouraged them to look away, to trust the ritual of the feast, rather than the unease rising within them. Some claimed that as the candles burned, the shadows they cast seemed almost animate, stretching and twisting across the faces of diners, reflecting grim visages that did not belong to any living person. The air seemed thick, each breath weighted with the memory of death, yet the music and the clinking of silver tried desperately to maintain a semblance of normalcy. As the evening progressed, whispers arose, small and tentative at first, then louder, seeping into the minds of those seated closest to the flickering lights. Guests spoke of nightmares they felt creeping across their shoulders, of shadows that lingered unnaturally, and of a heat that burned not only the skin, but the soul. Some claimed the scent of the candles invaded their dreams for weeks, leaving them restless, haunted by faint, almost imperceptible voices. The prince, seemingly oblivious to the fear, encouraged indulgence, claiming that horror heightened the flavors of the meal, that awareness of mortality sharpened the palate. By midnight, the hall had become a place of quiet terror. Guests dared not speak above a whisper, hearts pounding in time with the flickering flames. Some left early, eyes wide, faces pale, unable to remain in the presence of light born from death. Others lingered, trembling, compelled by curiosity, gluttony, or fear of disfavor. When the feast finally ended, the hall remained, suffused with the lingering scent and shadow of the human fat candles, as if the air itself had absorbed the horrors of the evening. The candle of human fat endured as legend, a haunting meditation on indulgence and mortality, on the delicate line between spectacle and terror. It reminded all who heard its tale that in medieval feasts, light could conceal horror, and that even the simplest pleasure, a glowing candle, a taste of wine, could carry with it the weight of unseen cruelty. A feast not only for body, but for fear itself. Along the rugged, fog-bound coast of medieval Scotland, the wind carried a scent of brine and something fouler, something unspoken. Waves crashed against jagged cliffs, hurling spray into the gray morning air, and the cries of gulls echoed across the frozen harbor. In a stone hall perched above this tumultuous shore, a lord famous for cruelty and cunning prepared a feast that would haunt the memories of all who attended. Long tables were set near tall windows, torches flickering against cold walls, and platters of seafood gleamed in the dim light. But this bounty was no ordinary harvest from nets or lines. The fish, shellfish, and crustaceans laid before the guests had been taken from the drowned bodies of shipwrecked sailors, victims of storms and misfortune, claimed from the unforgiving. See to decorate a table of abundance. Guests arrived in cloaks of wool and velvet, hearts warmed by fire and anticipation, unaware of the grim origins of their meal. The Lord himself presided over the table, his eyes glinting in torchlight, a faint smile tracing his lips as servants presented the grotesque display. At first, the hall murmured with polite admiration for the abundance. Plates were filled, Goblets raised and laughter attempted to mask the underlying chill. Yet as the first portions were tasted, unease settled like a shadow over the diners. Some claimed the air seemed heavier, saturated with the weight of drowned lives, the cries of men frozen in cold waters echoing faintly in the stone walls. Others whispered that the sea itself murmured, as though protesting the use of its fallen. As the evening deepened, visions intruded. Guests reported seeing faces beneath the waves, mouths open in silent pleas, eyes wide with terror, pressing against the surface of the platters. Some recoiled, spilling wine onto the boards, unable to stomach the feast, while others trembled yet continued, paralyzed by social expectation or morbid fascination. The torches flickered, shadows danced unnaturally along walls and beams, and a cold mist seeped in from the cliffs outside, chilling the bones of even the hardiest courtiers. By night's end, a few fell violently ill, others left in silence, haunted by the spectral images and the faint, mournful sounds of the drowned. The feast of the drowned endured in local legend, whispered from one generation to the next, a grim meditation on human hunger, maritime misfortune, and the ways cruelty can twist even the ocean's bounding into terror. Travelers along the coast still claim that, on fog-heavy nights, the faint sound of cries rises from the waves, as if the spirits of those taken continue to whisper warnings to those who dine with greed, or disregard the sea's unyielding claim. It serves as a haunting reminder that even abundance, when steeped in death, can become a banquet of horror, and that the sea remembers those who feast upon its fallen. In the shadowed valleys of 14th century Germany, where forests pressed close to stone castles and mist crept along the river banks, a minor noble prepared a feast to celebrate a victory over a rival monastery. The hall was austere yet imposing, lined with carved oak panels and tapestries depicting saints and battles. Torches flickered along the walls, casting long, wavering shadows, and the scent of roasted meats mingled with the smoke of the hearth. Guests arrived with anticipation, nobles and clerics alike, eager to partake in the bounty laid before them, yet hidden among the delicacies. A terror waited a secret that would haunt the hall long after the final toast. The feast proceeded with customary splendor, venison, spiced and golden, lay beside pies glazed with honey and wine that gleamed like liquid rubies. Laughter and polite conversation filled the air, punctuated by the clinking of silverware on fine porcelain, but beneath the polished surface of celebration, a darker act had been orchestrated. One monk, a captive of the noble's vengeance, had been boiled alive in secrecy, his body destined to become a grim centerpiece unknown to the diners. Some claimed they could hear muffled cries rising faintly from the kitchens, a sound as soft for certainty, yet impossible to dismiss. The guests, intoxicated on wine and the warmth of the hall, either ignored the unease or found themselves paralyzed by a creeping sense of dread. As plates were cleared and goblets refilled, the air seemed to thicken with tension. Some diners noticed a subtle, metallic tang lingering beneath the sweetness of desserts. Others felt an inexplicable chill despite the roaring fire. Shadows along the walls flickered unnaturally, as though the spirits of the fallen moved among the living, watching, judging. The noble maintained an air of composure, a calm orchestration of horror concealed beneath the guise of celebration. Whispers among the servants spoke of the monk's final moments, of cries muffled by bubbling water and spices, of a terror that infused the very air of the hall. By nightfall, the guests departed, many pale and silent, touched by a fear they could neither name nor fully comprehend. Chroniclers debated the veracity of the tale, questioning whether the roasted monk was literal or metaphor, yet the story endured in whispered legend. The hall, they said, remembered the walls retaining the echo of suffering, the scent of mortal fear lingering beneath polished stone. The roasted monk became a cautionary tale, a meditation on power, cruelty, and the thin line between indulgence and atrocity. It reminded all who heard it that some feasts consume more than appetite, they devour conscience, leaving only shadows where dignity and trust once sat. In the heart of Paris, during a winter when the plague shadowed every street and the fog clung to the Seine like a living thing, a wealthy merchant sought to host a feast that would display both his wealth and his cunning. The hall was expansive, lit by hundreds of candles whose flames danced across tapestries and polished oak. Platters of roasted meats, glazed pastries, and exotic spices filled the tables, the air rich with aromas that made mouths water and hearts quicken. Yet amid the glittering abundance, a hidden terror awaited. Small rodents, rats, and mice had been roasted, spiced, and glazed to appear delectable, intended to amuse the guests with novelty. or perhaps to exact a cruel test of nerves. The nobles arrived, their fur-lined robes brushing the floor. Their voice is echoing in polite greetings. The feast began with laughter, some daring to taste of the tiny roasted creatures. Finding them oddly tender beneath the cinnamon, pepper, and honey, musicians played eerie, lilting tunes, flutes and viols weaving melodies that felt slightly off-kilter, as though conjuring shadows at the edges of vision. At first, the diners found the spectacle curious, even amusing, until a whisper traveled among them. Some began to feel uneasy, a prickling sensation that something beyond the roasted rats watched their every move. Others claimed that eyes followed them across the hall, perhaps the merchant's own, blending from shadows, measuring reactions with a cold, deliberate precision. As the meal progressed, a wave of sickness swept through the hall. Some guests fell violently ill, clutching stomachs and vomiting into hastily brought basins. Others vanished from the records entirely, their departure unnoticed amid the chaos, leaving chairs empty and plates overturned. Servants moved quickly, attempting to conceal what had transpired, but the hall itself seemed to remember. The air remained thick with coppery tangs and a faint, scuttling echo that no candlelight could dispel. Whispers claimed that the merchant had orchestrated the entire event with purpose, using the feast as a tool to eliminate rivals under the guise of indulgence, blending superstition, fear, and hunger into a single, lethal performance. The feast of spice vermin persisted in legend, recounted in hushed tones across pairs for generations. It served as a cautionary tale of human appetite entwined with malice, reminding all that indulgence could mask cruelty, and that even the most dazzling feast might hide terror beneath its gilded surface. The rats, once mere creatures of the city's shadows, became symbols of the hidden dangers of curiosity, and the lingering memory of the banquet was a testament to how fear, cleverly disguised, could be served alongside honey and spice, leaving only shadows and whispers in its wake. In a castle nestled amid the rolling hills of northern Italy, where mist clung to the battlements and the river below mirrored the gray sky, a feast was prepared unlike any other. The noble host, a man of wealth and subtle cruelty, adorned the tables with silver and crystal, yet the true centerpiece was not meat or wine, but mirrors small, polished surfaces placed beneath glass plates so that each diner could see themselves as they ate. The air was rich with the aroma of roasted meats, spice breads, and simmering sauces, yet beneath the scent of indulgence lay a chill, subtle but insistent, as though the hall itself breathed with expectation. Guests arrived, dressed in velvet and lace, and marveled at the reflection of their own faces, unaware that the mirrors had been set with a purpose far more sinister than mere decoration. At first, diners admired the ingenuity. They could observe their own posture, their composure, even the careful motions of their hands as they lifted food to lips. Yet soon, an unease began to stir. The mirrors did more than reflect. They seemed to hold shadows, to distort, to twist the faces of those who gazed along. A sneer became a grimace. A laugh became a scream trapped in glass. Some reported glimpses of their own age accelerating, decades appearing in moments. A cruel trick of perception that left hearts pounding and breaths shallow. Whispers rose among the guests, some nervous, others fearful, as the reflection seemed almost alive, watching, judging, mocking. The meal continued, wine flowing to steady nerves. But the hall had become a theater of subtle horror. Some diners saw themselves not as they were, but as embodiments of every vice they harbored: greed, envy, gluttony, betrayal. Shadows flickered unnaturally across walls, dancing in time with the distorted faces beneath each plate. A few fled, unable to endure the psychological torment, but others stayed, fascinated and terrified, trapped in the interplay of their own reflections and the hall's eerie atmosphere. Even laughter carried an edge, sharp as glass, as if the mirrors absorbed sound and returned it warped, haunting. By night's end, the guests departed in silence, leaving the mirrored plates behind. Yet the memory lingered. The mirror feast became legend, a meditation on the human soul and the dangers of indulgence. A chilling reminder that some reflections reveal more than the surface, and that a feast can expose inner darkness as readily as it nourishes the body. Generations later, tales whispered of halls where mirrors watched too closely, and diners who glimpsed shadows of themselves never fully recovered. Haunted by the banquet, where the true horror lay not in what was eaten, but in what was seen. In a French chateau perched among the rolling hills, where the walls had seen decades of conquest and celebration, a lord prepared a feast to commemorate a hard-won victory. The hall was vast and ornate, tapestries depicting battle and glory, draping the walls, candles flickering in gilded sconces, and long tables groaning beneath the weight of roasted meats, honey pastries, and goblets of crimson wine. Outside, the winter wind whispered through the trees, carrying the scent of smoke from hearths and the faint tang of frost. The guests, nobles of the region, arrived in their finest attire, their voices echoing against the stone as laughter and conversation filled. The hall, the centerpiece of the banquet, was a massive bowl, roasting slowly over an open pyre at the center of the room. Flames licked its sides, casting shadows that danced like specters across the tapestries and walls. At first, the spectacle seemed a marvel of opulence and power, a demonstration of the Lord's ability to command both fire and flesh. Guests marveled, raising goblets in toasts and applause. Yet as the flames leapt higher, consuming not only the bowl, but the surrounding drapery, a crackle of terror rippled through the hall. Sparks ignited tapestries, and in moments, portions of the ceiling caught fire, sending embers drifting onto the tables. Screams mingled with shouts as nobles scrambled to move away from the advancing blaze. Some whispered that the fire had been intentional, a display meant to punish a rival or demonstrate dominance through controlled chaos. Others claimed it was misfortune, a reminder that even power could not tame all forces. Amid the chaos, the scent of charred meat and burning wood mingled with panic, and shadows of the guests themselves seemed to writhe against the walls, distorted by firelight. Servants moved frantically, trying to save both guests and precious platters, but the hall had become a theater of terror, every indulgence now entwined with risk and suffering. By dawn, the hall lay smoldering, blackened and silent, the feast destroyed by the flames that had promised grandeur. Survivors emerged, shaken and singed, carrying the memory of fire as vividly as any taste of meat or wine. The feast of burning flesh became legend, a cautionary tale that opulence can mask danger, that indulgence may summon catastrophe, and that some celebrations end not with satisfaction, but with the lingering scent of smoke, fear, and the charred remnants of what was once a banquet of delight. In a mist-shrouded castle atop the rolling hills of 15th century England, a lord prepared a banquet that would etch itself into the memories of all who attended. The stone hall was vast, austere yet imposing, lined with towering windows that framed the gray, fog-laden landscape. Outside, torches flickered along the walls, their light casting elongated shadows that stretched across tables laid with polished silver, fine porcelain, and platters of roasted meats glistening with spiced glaze. The air was thick with the scent of roasted game, warm bread, and honeyed wine, yet beneath the familiar aroma lingered a chill, a subtle unease that spoke of something more than mere ceremony. The guests arrived in their finest attire, nobles and courtiers drawn by curiosity and obligation alike. The Lord, his expression unreadable, welcomed each with a measured nod, and with the first course, he laid down the singular rule that would govern the evening. No words were to be spoken. Silence was absolute. At first, the restraint seemed elegant, even ceremonial. Forks and knives clicked delicately against plates, and the clinking of goblets punctuated the quiet rhythm of the feast. Yet soon, the absence of speech transformed into tension. Shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally across the hall, flickering in corners where no candle burned. Mirrors along the walls reflected not only the guests' faces, but subtle movements that no one had made. As wine flowed, unease deepened. Some noticed that shadows shifted independently of their owners, leaning closer, curling, observing. Those who dared to glance toward the Lord found him watching with an intensity that chilled the marrow, his eyes seeming to weigh each heartbeat. Rumors whispered among the silent diners. Those who broke the vow of silence were never seen again, dragged into hidden chambers by invisible hands or consumed by the very walls themselves. Panic stirred beneath restraint, yet the fear of offending the host, or worse, tempting fate, kept lips sealed and hands trembling. By midnight, only obedience remained. Figures hunched over platters, eyes hollow, faces pale, hearts pounding, in unison with the rhythm of the unseen. Some swore they heard murmurs rising from the stones themselves, soft, accusing, an echo of past disobedience. When the feast ended and candles guttered, the hall fell into unnatural quiet. Chairs stood empty, shadows lingered long after the guests had departed, and the Lord's eyes gleamed one final time before darkness claimed the room. The feast of silent guests endured in legend, a meditation on obedience, fear, and the quiet horror that can sit across from a full plate. It reminded all who heard its tale that silence can be both sanctuary and prison, that some feasts nourish more than appetite, they test courage, conformity, and the human soul itself. In the frostbitten lands of medieval Burgundy, a duke renowned for his obsession with loyalty and control prepared a banquet that would test not only appetites, but the fortitude of those seated before him. The hall was expansive, its stone walls adorned with tapestries depicting hunts and victories, torches flickering along the high arches, casting long, quivering shadows. The tables groaned under the weight of roasted meats, aged cheeses, crusty breads, and delicate pastries. At first glance, the feast seemed a celebration of abundance. Yet beneath the surface, a subtle cruelty had been woven into each dish. The Duke, ever watchful, had instructed that certain delicacies, meats, and cheeses, carefully selected, be deliberately left to spoil. The guests, nobles of the region, arrived in finery, their senses enchanted by the richness of aromas and the glitter of silver. At first, they noticed nothing amiss, indulging politely, tasting with refined gestures. But as the night deepened and wine flowed more freely, a stench began to rise, faint at first, then unmistakable, the odor of rot, sour and pungent, curling around the hall like a living thing. Some courtiers paused, glancing at one another with uncertain expressions. Others forced themselves to swallow with grim determination, not daring to offend the Duke. One by one, the effects of the spoiled delicacies became evident. Nausea swept through the hall, some diners convulsing quietly in their seats, others pale and trembling. Whispers rippled like a secret current. Some believed the Duke had poisoned rivals under the guise of culinary challenge. Others thought it a test of loyalty, a subtle demonstration that submission was measured not in words, but in endurance. Shadows seemed to twist with each gasp, each wretched breath, as if the hall itself fed on the suffering it contained. The Duke, seated upon his high dais, watched with an intensity that left no doubt of his intent, a quiet satisfaction glimmering in his eyes. By the end of the evening, only a few remained composed, cheeks flushed with fever, hands trembling, and eyes haunted by the memory of what they had consumed. The hall, though seemingly emptied of overt drama, retained the invisible traces of horror, the lingering coppery scent of sickness, the subtle twist of shadows along the walls, the quiet echo of suppressed screams, the feast of spoiled delicacies. Endured in legend, a grim meditation on power, fear, and human endurance. It reminded all who heard the tale that indulgence could be weaponized, that a table of abundance might conceal judgment, and that sometimes loyalty is measured not by words, but by the courage or the fragility of the body beneath the feast. In the icy halls of a Scandinavian palace, where winter winds howled across frozen fjords and snow blanketed the earth in silent white, a king prepared a banquet that would etch itself into the minds of those who dared to attend. The great hall was a cathedral of frost, with columns carved from pale stone, their surfaces etched with runes and ancient symbols, and torches flickering in sconces, casting light that seemed to tremble in sympathy with the cold outside. Tables were laid with platters of fish and game, their surfaces chilled atop blocks of ice, and goblets of wine shimmered like frozen rubies, reflecting the pale light in fractured patterns. The air was heavy with a scent both sweet and bracing, a mingling of spice meats and the sharp tang of winter air. Seeping through the great doors, guests arrived in furs and velvet, their breaths puffing in small clouds, and marveled at the glacial display. Yet beneath the beauty lay a subtle unease, for each plate seemed to weep. Tiny rivulets of blood-colored liquid ran across the icy surfaces, glimmering like tears caught in frost. The king declared it the blessing of the gods, a sign that nature itself honored the feast. But those who partook could not shake a creeping dread. Some claimed that with each bite, vision seized them, fishermen struggling beneath waves, sailors clutching at ice-choked waters, mouths open in silent pleas. Others reported that the eyes of the fish followed them, dark and accusing, watching with a stillness that chilled the soul more than the frigid air ever could. As the evening unfolded, the haunting beauty of the feast became entwined with psychological torment. Guests trembled with a mix of cold, fear, and awe, wine barely warming their spirits. Some fell ill, shivering uncontrollably, while others swore they saw figures rise from the ice itself, shadows of the drowned entwined with the banquet's bounty. Whispered tales spoke of servants who, upon leaving the hall, found droplets of red frozen on their boots, impossible to remove, as if the feast itself bled into the world beyond. The king, untroubled, observed the reactions with a measured calm. each expression of horror a silent affirmation of his command over both table and mind. By night's end, guests departed, pale and haunted, carrying visions that would not fade. The Feast of Frozen Tears lingered in legend, a chilling testament to the cruel elegance of medieval extravagance. It reminded all who heard its tale that abundance could be a prism of torment, that beauty can mask dread, and that sometimes even the simplest pleasure, a bite of fish, a sip of wine, can leave one haunted by the frozen echoes of suffering. In a lavish hall of Spain, where gilded beams stretched overhead and tapestries depicted battles long past, a count prepared a banquet that promised indulgence and spectacle. The tables were laden with platters of roasted meats, sweet pastries, and goblets brimming with wine that caught the torchlight in deep crimson flashes. Servants moved swiftly, attending to every detail, their presence a quiet hum beneath the chatter of nobles in velvet and silk. Yet beneath the surface of opulence, a strange and unsettling design had been woven into the feast, one that would leave an indelible mark upon all who dared to sit at the table. As the meal began, guests noticed little at first. The food was rich, the wine heady, and the air was alive with laughter and conversation. Yet gradually, a pattern emerged. The servants, once bustling efficiently between tables, began to vanish. One by one, they disappeared into the shadowed corridors, leaving half-prepared dishes and overturned trays in their absence. The nobles, unsure whether to notice or ignore, hesitated, glances darting toward the doors and stairways where the disappearances occurred. Some whispered fears, others laughed nervously, attempting to maintain the guise of etiquette, but the air thickened with unease, as if the walls themselves had taken part in the intrigue. By the middle of the evening, the hall was transformed. The absence of the servants became tangible, a void that spoke louder than words. Guests reported faint echo screams muffled by stone, hurried footsteps that led nowhere, the clatter of trays abandoned mid-flight. Some speculated that the Count had sacrificed the servants to appease unseen forces, others that he delighted in watching the powerless vanish, a demonstration of control cloaked in ceremony. Shadows grew longer, flickering unnaturally across tapestries and walls, twisting into grotesque forms that seemed to mock the diner's fear. When the feast ended, the hall was eerily quiet, tables adorned with untouched platters, chairs pushed back in rigid silence. Those who survived spoke in hushed tones of the vanished attendants, of doors that opened to nothing, of footsteps that faded into shadow. The feast of the disappearing servants endured in legend, a meditation on human fragility, greed, and the unpredictable horrors that can lurk behind even the most ornate displays of wealth. It reminded all who heard its tale that abundance and luxury can conceal fear, and that sometimes the greatest terror is not what is served on the plate, but what disappears in its midst. In a stately manor in France, nestled among orchards, heavy with winter fruit, a minor noble prepared a feast that promised sweetness, indulgence, and subtle peril. The tables were adorned with baked apples, each golden and glistening, filled with spice mixtures that released aromas of cinnamon, honey, and clove. Candles flickered in polished sconces, casting warm light over goblets of deep red wine, and the hall was filled with the rustle of silk in murmured anticipation. Guests arrived, curious and eager, their faces alight with the innocent pleasure of a seasonal delicacy, unaware that beneath the glossy skins of the apples, a hidden danger awaited. At first, the feast was met with delight. Nobles bit into the baked fruit, savoring the sweetness and warmth, laughter echoing off the stone walls. Yet soon, unease crept among the diners. Some felt a sudden dizziness, a fluttering unease that prickled at their limbs. Others convulsed violently, their bodies betraying them even as they struggled to maintain composure. A few vanished entirely by morning, leaving only empty chairs and whispered rumors behind. The nobles' intention remained a matter of debate. Some believed it an accident, others a calculated act of revenge, and still others suspected a cruel amusement designed to test the boundaries of trust and indulgence. The hall, though outwardly elegant, seemed to respond to the unfolding terror. Shadows lengthened unnaturally, flickering across tapestries and reflecting in polished silver. The scent of spices, once sweet, became heavy, almost suffocating, and the laughter of earlier guests was replaced by murmurs of fear. Those who survived carried the memory of trembling hands and burning mouths. A lingering taste of innocence turned lethal. The apples, ordinary in appearance, became instruments of dread, a reminder that even the simplest pleasures can harbor unseen danger. The feast of poisoned apples endured as a dark parable, whispered through the corridors of history. It spoke of the fragile boundary between the light and death, of how indulgence can be weaponized, and of the subtle terror that can accompany the most ordinary of foods. It reminded all who heard its tale that horror need not arrive in swords, or fire can come wrapped in sweetness, leaving fear to linger long after the last bite has been swallowed. In a remote hall deep within the Carpathian Mountains, shrouded by mists that rolled down from darkened peaks, a lord prepared a feast that blurred the line between life and memory. The hall itself was ancient, built from cold stone and timber, darkened with centuries, its walls adorned with ancestral shields and faded tapestries depicting hunts, battles, and long-forgotten ceremonies. At the center of the tables, in stark display, lay the bones of long-dead ancestors, meticulously clean, polished, and arranged across platters and chalices. The air smelled faintly of earth and incense, a mingling that carried both reverence and unease as guests arrived under the pale light of torches, the fog curling at their boots. At first, the feast appeared ceremonial, even respectful. Platters of roasted meats, stews, and spice breads were served with care. Wine flowed freely, and the guests raised goblets in tribute to lineage and legacy. Yet as the meal progressed, an uncanny sensation settled upon the hall. Some diners claimed they heard faint whispers emanating from the skeletal remains, voices soft, murmuring disapproval, warning, or secret knowledge carried from a time long past. Laughter turned nervous, conversation faltered, and shadows seemed to flicker independently of the torchlight. Certain bones trembled under the weight of plates, as if recalling the weight of memory and the touch of generations long dead. By the second hour, fear had begun to grip the diners. A few confessed that they saw eyes within the skulls, black hollows that seemed to watch, tracking every gesture, every bite. Shadows along the walls twisted unnaturally, stretching and curling, forming fleeting shapes that appeared human yet impossible. Some guests, overwhelmed by terror, vanished without a trace, leaving overturned goblets and empty chairs as evidence of their sudden absence. Whispers spread that the Lord had summoned spirits through the display, that the dead themselves were reclaiming the night, and that those who sat too long at the table risked becoming part of the ancestral assembly forever. When the feast concluded, the hall returned to an eerie stillness, yet the memory of whispered bones lingered. Guests departed pale and shaken, some swearing the voices followed them through corridors and hallways long after leaving the manor. The Feast of Whispering Bones became legend, a meditation on mortality, memory, and the weight of the dead upon the living. It reminded all who heard the tale that even the most opulent banquet can carry the echoes of the past, and that the shadows of ancestors, once awakened, may sit silently beside even the most lavish spread, observing, judging, and whispering secrets no living mouth dares to repeat. In a northern Italian duchy, where wealth and artistry intertwine like the intricate mosaics of the city's churches, a noble prepared a banquet that would dazzle the senses and test the courage of those who dared to indulge. The hall was vast and gleaming, its polished floors reflecting torchlight that danced across frescoed ceilings. Tables were laden with delicacies, platters of roasted meats, sugared pastries, and goblets of wine shimmering like liquid rubies. Yet the true centerpiece of this feast was neither food nor wine, but a display of desserts gilded with molten gold, each piece a glittering jewel under the flickering candlelight. The air smelled of honey, caramel, and metallic warmth, a heady blend that promised both opulence and peril. Guests arrived in velvet and brocade, their eyes widening as the golden confections were carried to the tables. The desserts shimmered hypnotically, reflecting the grandeur of the hall and the noble's power. At first, the marvel captivated all. Bites were taken with awe, whispers of admiration spreading across the tables. Yet soon, the beauty of the gilded feast revealed its danger. A careless nibble or misjudged forkful brought immediate agony. Molten gold burned flesh, sending shrieks through the hall, mingling pain with fear. Some guests dropped the desserts, clattering silver and crystal echoing in the vast chamber, while others, gritting teeth through pain, continued as if obedience or courage could temper the molten terror. As wine flowed and nerves strained, whispers spread among the diners. Some claimed the noble intended punishment, others suspected a demonstration of fortitude, a test of endurance disguised as indulgence. Shadows cast by the golden glow flickered, unnaturally, stretching across the walls like twisted fingers. As though the hall itself conspired to magnify fear, the metallic scent clung to robes, hands, and teeth alike, leaving an invisible mark of the night's terror, while the echoes of screams intertwined with laughter, creating a dissonant symphony that haunted the senses. By the feast's end, Those who survived bore not only physical burns, but a lingering sense of dread. The Feast of Molten Gold endured in legend, a chilling reminder that opulence can conceal danger, and that even beauty, when twisted, can sear both body and soul. The golden confections became symbols of peril hidden in allure, and the hall's flickering shadows whispered to all who dared remember, not every marvel is safe to taste, and some feasts leave wounds that no wine or candlelight can heal. In a grand chateau of France, where sunlight once gleamed on polished floors and walls adorned with gilded tapestries, a lord prepared a feast that would twist beauty into peril. Crystal goblets shimmered in candlelight, delicate plates gleamed, as though kissed by frost, and platters of roasted meats, pastries, and fruits were arranged with meticulous care. The air was scented with honeyed wine, herbs, and roasted game, yet beneath the elegance lingered an invisible tension, subtle but insistent, like the hum of anticipation before a storm. Guests arrived, noble and proud, drawn by the promise of indulgence and spectacle, unaware that the feast itself carried danger in every gleam and glint. At first, the meal appeared perfect. Courtiers marveled at the craftsmanship, crystal delicate enough to shatter with a whisper, dishes fine enough to seem weightless, each plate reflecting the flickering candlelight in mesmerizing patterns. Yet some of these objects were flawed, their razor-sharp edges hidden beneath the ornate designs. As the diners ate, subtle injuries began. A slice of bread cut a hand, a gleaming goblet nicked a lip, a fork grazed the skin with an almost imperceptible slash. Whispers of unease spread, as a few guests recoiled, glancing around for reassurance or explanation. Laughter, initially polite, grew nervous, punctuated by the occasional gasp of pain. As the meal continued, the hall transformed. Shadows of the flames danced across the walls, twisting and bending as if the hall itself were alive, echoing the fear growing among the diners. Some suffered deeper injuries, blood mingling with wine and food, leaving stains that mirrored the chaos within. Others grew pale and trembling, unsure whether the harm was intentional or a cruel accident of design. Some chroniclers suggested the Lord delighted in the spectacle, a subtle demonstration of dominance and control. The interplay of beauty and danger became a silent theater, where every bite carried the possibility of pain and every glance reflected fear as much as curiosity. By the conclusion of the feast, several guests were gravely injured, their composure shattered along with their delicate glassware. The hall, though outwardly still and ornate, retained the memory of wounds, both physical and psychological, whispered through corridors and echoed in empty goblets. The feast of shattered glass endured in legend, a chilling testament to the fragility hidden beneath elegance. It reminded all who heard its tale that beauty can wound, and that opulence, when twisted, can transform indulgence into terror, leaving a lasting scar on both body and spirit. In a Venetian palace bathed in the golden light of setting sun, where marble floors gleamed and canals whispered beyond ornate windows, a noble prepared a feast that promised both splendor and dread. The centerpiece was a peacock, roasted whole, its tail feathers dyed in iridescent colors and displayed in a fan across the banquet table. The hall was alive with color and sound. Goblets clanked, silk rustled, and candles flickered, casting shadows that danced along frescoed walls. Guests arrived, enraptured by the spectacle, their eyes wide at the vibrant display. Yet beneath their admiration lingered an unease as old as the superstitions, whispered among Venetian nobles. At first, the meal was met with awe. Conversations hummed under the ornate ceilings, glasses were raised in tribute, and the richness of food and wine promised indulgence. Yet soon, stories of unease began to weave through the hall, like a hidden current. Some claimed the peacock carried a curse from distant lands, whispered across oceans by exotic merchants who had brought it to the nobles' table. Those who tasted the meat reported nightmares, visions of their own deaths, shadows stalking them through narrow canals, and cold, watching eyes that seemed to follow them even in daylight. A few fell ill suddenly, their skin flushing, lips trembling, and eyes widening as unseen horrors pressed close. Others disappeared entirely by morning, leaving carved place settings and empty chairs as eerie testimony. As the night deepened, the hall seemed to pulse with a quiet, almost malevolent energy. Shadows flickered unnaturally, twisting along walls and reflecting in gilded mirrors, elongating and bending in ways that defied reason. Guests whispered in trembling tones. Though no sound broke the formal etiquette, fear hung heavier than the scent of roasting spices. The noble, serene in his seat, watched with eyes that mirrored both pride and mystery. as if he alone knew the fate woven into the meal. Each bite became a negotiation with unseen forces. Each glance at the peacock's vivid feathers a reminder that beauty could conceal menace. By dawn, the banquet hall was nearly empty, save for those who survived with shaken minds and hearts. Heavy with dread, the feast of the cursed peacock endured as a chilling legend of Venice, a warning that exotic indulgence, superstition, and ambition could intertwine to summon unseen terror. It reminded all who heard the tale that even the most resplendent display might harbor darkness, and that sometimes the most dazzling spectacle carries a hidden, inescapable curse. In a grand hall of a Germanic stronghold, where high-arched ceilings met cold stone walls and tapestries of hunts, and battles hung heavy with the weight of history, a lord prepared a banquet unlike any other. The tables were laden with overflowing platters of roasted meats, glistening pastries, cheeses, fruits, and goblets brimming with wine that shimmered in candlelight. The abundance was staggering, a testament to wealth and power, promising indulgence that would satisfy even the most voracious appetites. Guests arrived in velvet and fur, their eyes widening at the sheer spectacle, unaware that the feast would soon defy reason, appetite, and the very notion of satisfaction. At first, the diners marveled, slicing into tender meats, biting into sweet pastries, and raising goblets in celebration. The aroma of roasting game mingled with the warmth of spiced wine, and laughter echoed through the hall. Yet soon, a strange and unsettling sensation took hold. No matter how much they ate, hunger persisted. Plates were emptied, then refilled. Yet the gnawing emptiness in the belly refused to yield. Some guests grew frantic, devouring continuously, their hands trembling with both desire and frustration. Others, overwhelmed by the insatiable void, fell into despair, clutching their chests as if the hunger had seeped into their very bones. Whispers spread through the hall, speculation mingling with fear. Some believed the Lord had cursed the food, punishing greed and overindulgence. Others murmured that it was a test of morality, a reflection of human desire made manifest, showing that unchecked appetite leads not to satisfaction, but to torment. Shadows twisted unnaturally across the walls, flickering as though alive, observing, mocking. Faces once flushed with joy became pale, eyes hollow, hands shaking as the endless hunger gnawed not only at their stomachs, but at their courage and sanity. By the feast's end, the hall was filled with despair. Guests either collapsed or pacing in desperate cycles, and the Lord watched silently, his gaze both commanding and inscrutable. The feast of endless hunger endured in legend as a chilling meditation on desire, greed, and the insatiable nature of human longing. It reminded all who heard the tale that abundance can be a trap, that indulgence can consume the spirit, and that sometimes a banquet offers not satisfaction, but a mirror to the emptiness that dwells within. In a manner of northern France, austere and cold with stone walls that seemed to absorb the flickering torchlight, a baron prepared a feast both grotesque and deliberate. The tables were laid with roasted meats, breads, and rich sauces, their scents mingling with the faint tang of fear that seemed already present in the hall. At the center of each table lay a shocking centerpiece, platters adorned with severed human fingers, allegedly taken from executed criminals. They were arranged with care, polished to a grim gleam, as if etiquette and horror had conspired to become one. The noble invited his guests to partake delicately, with a smile that suggested the bravest or most foolish would be rewarded. At first, shock rippled through the hall. Some courtiers recoiled, covering their eyes. Others, trembling, obeyed, picking up the macabre morsels with silver utensils. The hall was silent except for the faint clink of cutlery on bone, each movement magnifying the weight of terror that had settled like a fog over the diners. Whispers passed between pale faces. Was it punishment, a show of power, a warning to rivals? Each bite carried not only taste, but the moral weight of complicity. The fingers, cold and unsettlingly lifelike, seemed almost to twitch beneath the touch, an eerie illusion or the echo of human horror to rob to dismiss. As the night deepened, the hall seemed to pulse with a quiet menace. Some guests grew ill, racked with nausea or feverish chills, while others reported visions of fingers twitching on their plates, bending toward them as if alive. Shadows along the walls shifted unnaturally, flickering in time with the diner's growing dread. The baron, seated above the feast, watched with calm precision, as though measuring courage and obedience as carefully as the portioned fingers before him. Fear mingled with fascination, horror intertwined with etiquette. Every glance, every motion became a test, and the hall itself seemed to participate in the dark pageantry. By the end of the evening, Several nobles had succumbed to illness or terror, while others left pale and haunted, carrying the memory of cold bone against silver and the unsettling realization that indulgence can mask complicity and cruelty. The Feast of the Severed Fingers endured in legend, a meditation on power, cruelty, and human complicity. It reminded all who heard the tale that even a single bite can bear the weight of terror, and that a table, though opulent, may conceal horror beyond comprehension. In a smoky hall deep within Bohemia, a lord prepared a banquet that would blur the line between spectacle and terror, the walls blackened by centuries of torches, or murals of hunts and victories long past, their colors muted beneath layers of soot. Tables stretched along the hall, laden with roasted meats, spiced breads, and goblets of wine that shimmered with a ruby glow. Yet atop every table flickered small fires, embers crackling and dancing across platters and silverware. The scent of smoke mingled with roasted game, creating a haze that clung to the air in the guests' lungs, a mixture of indulgence and unease that set hearts to quickening. At first, the diners were entranced. Flames licked the edges of dishes, casting shadows that danced across tapestries and ceilings. The warmth of the fire was seductive, and the aroma of food filled the senses, yet there was an underlying tension, subtle but insistent, that whispered of danger. Some guests marveled at the spectacle, daring to reach for roasted meats as sparks leapt onto platters or gilded robes, while others recoiled, sensing the edge where beauty turned perilous. The embers seemed almost alive, curling toward hands, at faces, teasing fear from those who dared partake. As the evening deepened, the hall transformed. Shadows became more than mere absence of light. They twisted and writhed, forming fleeting, grotesque figures. Some guests claimed to see faces emerging from the smoke, rising from the ashes in silent torment, their mouths open in screams that no ears could hear yet minds could not forget. Wine and fear mingled, laughter trembled into nervous whispers, and the hall itself seemed to pulse in time with the flickering flames. Every bite, every sip, became a negotiation with the unseen, a delicate dance between indulgence and peril. By dawn, the hall was charred in corners, smoke lingering in thick veils over tables and floors. Guests departed shaken, some ill, some haunted by visions that would not fade. The Feast of Smoldering Ashes endured as legend, a cautionary tale of spectacle turned peril, and of fire's unyielding claim over both indulgence and human folly. It reminded all who heard its tale that a feast can consume more than appetite it can, ignite fear, leaving scars in memory as lasting as any burn upon flesh. In medieval England, in a hall of stone and shadow where the wind howled through narrow windows, a wealthy earl prepared a feast that merged dining with dread. At the center of the long, polished tables hung a corpse, suspended from the ceiling by thick ropes of traitor. Some whispered, whose hollow eyes seemed to stare into the very souls of the guests. Candles flickered against the walls, casting long, trembling shadows that danced across tapestries depicting battles and hunts, their forms now mingling with the dark silhouette of the hanged man. The air smelled of roasted meats, wine, and the faint, lingering tang of death, an unsettling perfume that clung to garments and nerves alike. Guests arrived, noble and proud, initially drawn by the promise of indulgence and spectacle. Yet their gazes could not avoid the hanging figure. At first, conversation and laughter attempted to mask unease, but as platters of roasted meats and pastries were passed, the corpse seemed to command attention. Some swore the body shifted subtly, a skeletal finger pointing toward those who laughed too loudly, eyes that appeared to narrow in judgment. Others claimed a cold wind moved along the hall despite closed windows, brushing against necks and searing the skin with the sensation of icy fingers. Murmurs spread, madness, ritual, or a message intended by the earl. Fear threaded itself through the hall as seamlessly as the tablecloths stretched across polished wood. As the feast continued, the tension thickened, shadows stretched unnaturally, twisting along walls and ceilings as though alive. Guests found themselves glancing upward involuntarily, hearts pounding, unable to escape the sense that the hanged man observed more than posture. He seemed to witness thought, morality, even sin. Some diners refused bites, eyes wide with horror. Others forced themselves to eat, trembling as if etiquette could shield them from the figure's silent accusation. The earl watched calmly, a conductor of fear, orchestrating an interplay of indulgence and terror that left no mind untouched. By the end of the night, those who survived departed pale, hearts heavy with dread, and whispers lingered long after. The hall fell silent. The feast of the hanged man endured as legend, a haunting reminder that power can transform dining into a theater of fear, and that sometimes the guest of honor is death itself. In the flickering candlelight of memory, the corpse remains suspended in shadow, an eternal observer of human indulgence and the fragile boundary between life and terror. In a hall of Burgundy, where walls were draped in velvet and chandeliers flickered like captive stars, a lord prepared a feast both sumptuous and sinister. Every table was strewn with roses, their petals crushed beneath platters of roasted meats and rich pastries. Their colors, once vibrant, now dulled and mottled with decay. The scent of flowers mingled with the heavy aroma of roasting game, yet beneath it lay a subtle, rank undertone, a whisper of rot that crept into the noses and hearts of the guests. The hall was alive with music and laughter, yet a tension threaded through the air, a quiet unease that accompanied each step across the polished stone floors. At first, the diners marveled at the display, raising goblets in tribute to both beauty and abundance. The crushed roses, intended as decoration, seemed almost to animate the banquet, their fragrance cloying and strange, curling around the senses with a hint of decay that grew steadily stronger. As the evening progressed, whispers of discomfort began. Some claimed the scent sickened them, a creeping nausea that gripped the stomach and mind alike. Others swore they glimpsed fleeting shapes in the petals, like faces twisted in silent agony. The combination of sumptuous food and subtle rot created a dissonance, a feast that promised pleasure but delivered unease in equal measure. By the second hour, the hall's shadows seemed restless. Guests began to see visions in the petals, bodies entwined with thorny stems, faces emerging from the blooms, mouths open in silent screams. Some fainted, overwhelmed by the dual assault of stench and imagination. Others fled into the night, leaving goblets and plates behind. The Lord, serene in his seat, observed the scene with inscrutable satisfaction, as if measuring fear as precisely as etiquette. Each rose, each dish, became a symbol of beauty corrupted, a reminder that decay lurks beneath even the most elegant exterior. By dawn, the hall lay heavy with a lingering scent of rot and candle smoke, the echoes of startled cries and panicked footsteps fading into silence. The feast of rotting roses endured in legend, a poetic horror of sensory betrayal, where beauty, left to decay, poisoned both body and mind. It served as a reminder that even the most delicate luxury can conceal corruption, and that celebration, when intertwined with neglect and cruelty, can transform into nightmare. On the edge of the Black Forest, where twisted trees clawed at the fog-laden sky and the wind carried whispers of long-forgotten deeds, a ruined castle held its final recorded feast. The hall, draped in black velvet, seemed suspended in time, its stones cold and unforgiving, lit by candles that flickered with an unnatural, almost living light. Shadows stretched along the walls, writhing across arches and vaulted ceilings, as if the very air were alive with memory and malice. Guests arrived, noble and wary, drawn by curiosity, ambition, or the promise of indulgence, yet unaware that they were stepping into a gathering where reality itself had begun to unravel. At first, the banquet appeared formal, if darkly exquisite. Platters of roasted meats, exotic fruits, spiced breads, and goblets of deep red wine were arranged with precision. The flickering candlelight reflected in silver and crystal, casting fractured glimmers across the hall, as though each surface held a fragment of another world. The shadows, however, moved with a life independent of flame and stone. They twisted around the tables, climbing walls, curling along ceilings, creeping between guests, sometimes stretching toward food, sometimes toward flesh, always watching, always waiting. A hushed tension settled over the diners, and even the bravest felt the weight of unseen eyes, sensing that the hall had long ceased to be merely a place of feasting. As the night deepened, the shadows grew bolder. Portions of food vanished inexplicably, replaced by darkness that seemed to pulse with a heartbeat of its own. Some diners reported seeing faces in the black folds, mouths opening to whisper forgotten names, while others swore that hands, intangible yet insistent, grazed their skin. Panic mingled with etiquette as guests struggled to maintain composure. Yet every movement was mirrored, twisted, and distorted in the living darkness. The candles guttered and flared, revealing glimpses of figures that were neither human nor entirely shadow. And the air grew heavy with fear that clung to robes, hair, and skin alike. By the final hour, several guests had vanished entirely, leaving only empty chairs and overturned goblets, their fates swallowed by the darkness that had long inhabited the hall. Those who remained departed with hearts pounding and minds fractured, carrying the memory of a feast where horror was the main course, and the shadows were the only guests to survive. The final banquet of shadows endured in legend as a meditation on fear, memory, and mortality. A reminder that some gatherings leave more than hunger behind. They leave the lingering touch of darkness, the echo of vanished voices, and the haunting certainty that certain feasts are never truly concluded.